Hi, everybody. Thanks for your patience. We are switching over.
Okay, I'm ending the live video.
Oh, we're just in time for my dogs to be upset about something. So
Perfect. Perfect. All right, and then I'm gonna see if I can go live again and stream this. Um,
okay, I'm making you. Well, when you're done, I'll make you a host as well.
you.
But yeah,
I'm
it
gonna
would.
try to figure out how to get this
So
to.
on Zoom, so here's what it looks like right now, the people that are attending it, that have gotten on so far. This person's speaking.
Yeah.
If I want to see her,
Oh,
I've just pinned her.
okay.
I just use the little buttons. Whenever there's little buttons over here, there's a view thing I could hit and do something with. But those three little buttons usually opens up to give you different options.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Streaming software. Oh, but it's streaming software. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I know, Sarah, I can't mute. Everyone does need to mute themselves, but that was a conversation on purpose. We will. We're just not getting started yet. Just everybody hang tight.
Okay, I have a stream key to paste
Jessica,
with my-
I really encourage you not to try to go live on Facebook with this. It's
Okay.
going to cause a lot of problems. So just
Okay.
let's just be on here.
All right.
Have I got a show for you? And that show
And
is
I need everyone to mute themselves, please. And I'm going to mute for a second because my dogs are upset. Okay, Jessica, you're muted. So
I
unmute
was.
yourself.
Yeah.
And now you are the host.
Okay.
Which means that, I didn't set this up ahead of time, so I don't have special powers. So you'll need to let people in as they show up.
Okay. There's a way to just let everybody in automatically. You can set the settings to do that.
Well,
I guess I can set the settings to do that.
you are the host. Yeah. If you hit mute all, you will mute me as well. So
Noted.
don't
And we're
everybody
not
else.
we are currently recording, it looks like. Okay. Why don't you start talking, Stremming, about why we wanted to do this? So that we have that in this recording, because I did it on
Yeah, I
Facebook,
was
but
planning
think
on
it's real
fully
losing.
starting over because that will be gone. Like we're not going to post that live video. So okay, so hi, welcome everyone. We will do these on Zoom from here on out. Now that figured out ahead of time. We wanted to get on here and chat because this recent paper from the Dog Aging Project has the internet kind of all abuzz, and it is being framed in a really specific way. And it's important. Anytime research comes out, anytime a paper comes out, it's going to be framed in whatever way the person disseminating it to you or the people disseminating it to you would like to frame it, if they choose. And so we're going live to talk about it so that Jessica can disseminate it, basically because she's good at that, that really particular skill set, which is science communication. And so we wanted to get on here and just really talk about what does the data say? Oh, let's see. What does the data actually say? And kind of where do we go from here? Because I think it's definitely being framed in really specific ways that we want to discuss. But we're going to start with I just said one reason Jessica's qualified to talk about is she's a good science communicator, good disseminator of that kind of information. But there's more. So Jessica, are you ready to jump in and talk about your kind of special qualifications, honestly, to be talking about this paper?
Yes, and why I just posted the link to this Zoom call on the Functional Dog Collaborative page. So while I'm talking, maybe you can go post the link on the group.
I can do that. And I'm going to put right now a link in the chat to the study, as
Yes.
well as our the FTC's kind of breakdown of the study. So
Yeah.
I will do that. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so what you
You've got
see
the floor.
there is the citation for the study, and then original is the link to the actual paper. FTC summary, for those who don't know, we have an article library where we summarize papers of interest to the community, and so our summary of the paper is there. So yeah, and the oh my God. So why am I qualified to talk about this other than that I really like talking about this kind of research? Well, first of all, I mean, an outside view is always useful. Secondly, I was involved in a very similar situation in my my work with the dog, with the Darwin's Ark study. So we released a study which we referred to as the Mutt paper. And similarly, I felt that the science behind it was really good, which is what I feel about this paper as well. These are very, very qualified, competent, and responsible researchers who are doing the paper that we're talking about today. Which it was the same thing as I felt about the paper that came out of the lab I was working for. But I did feel that in both cases, there were a lot of very specific findings, and that there's, when you're releasing a paper, you want to pull all your findings together and sort of give this, tie it up in a bow to summarize it for people. Like, what does all of this mean? And so there was some disagreement with the Mutt paper about what it all meant. And here I think that I have a different take on what it all means than my interpretation of what the researchers have said. So, and I'll go into that. The other thing I wanted to say is that the obvious solution here would have been to have one of the researchers come on either my podcast or Stremming's podcast. And we know that they've been on some other podcasts, which is great. And the reason we didn't ask them to do that was that I was really uncomfortable with basically saying, can you come on and explain how you and I disagree about sort of how this paper is framed? That is an uncomfortable thing to talk about, and I don't like bringing people on where I suspect that we're going to have different viewpoints on something, because I don't like having it's just very hard for everybody to have sort of a friendly, comfortable conversation about that in public, right? So, and to be specific, the sentence that made me hesitate to ask that of them was in their abstract. And the abstract, again, is sort of this place where you want to sort of pull everything together and say, tying it up with a bow, this is kind of how we're framing the paper. And the sentence says, purebred dogs in the Dog Aging Project did not show higher lifetime prevalence of medical conditions compared to mixed breed dogs. And my perspective was, if they had said higher lifetime prevalence of common medical conditions, I would have thought we were completely on the same page. And I said this when we started out on the Facebook Live, but I'll say it again. More than happy to have a conversation with them. I know that they advertised this live. So if any of them are listening and they want to weigh in, if they want to send me feedback afterwards, I'm also happy to amplify that. That doesn't have to be private if they don't want it to be. If the people who are watching this are curious, if they sort of want to communicate with the people who come and watch this, I'm happy to make that happen. I'm happy to share what they have to say. And I want to emphasize once again, I have the utmost respect for these researchers. I don't know that they really realized that their paper was going to be taken as sort of a salvo in this battle between people who are disagreeing about the status of purebred dogs in this world. So that's what I have to say about that. Sarah, back at you.
Okay, so what we need to get into now is what the paper actually said. So essentially, the first questions have to do with health. What does the paper say about health? And kind of, if you can talk about what health is, what the paper says about that, start there. And then we need to pin down the big question, which is, does the paper say purebred dogs are healthy or healthier than the general population of dogs?
Right, because the takeaway message that a lot of people took from this paper is that purebred dogs are healthier than mixed breed dogs, or that they are equivalently healthy. So what the paper definitely says, so the basically what they did was they took this very, very large sample set that they had, where they asked owners about disorders that their dogs had been diagnosed with at the veterinarians. And they skew a bit to older dogs, because the Dog Aging Project. And they mentioned in the paper they skew a bit to older dogs, which means that some of these dogs people are remembering from, 10 years ago or more. Some of them, however, are young dogs. So the owners would report, what has the dog ever been seen at the veterinarian for? And then they took a look at what all of the things that were, all of the different diagnoses that dogs had received from veterinarians. They compiled the top 10, and they reported that in whether the top 10 diagnoses had been seen, each of them more commonly in mixed breeds versus purebreds, all purebreds together. Then they also took a look at some of the most common purebreds in their sample set. And they took a look at which diagnoses were most common in among those purebreds. And they did some comparisons there, which were interesting. Then they took those top 10 diagnoses across purebreds and mixed breeds, and they took all of the top 10 diagnoses across the most common purebreds, and they put all of those most common diagnoses together. There were 52 of those. And so if you look in the paper, in addition to that initial top 10 list, which is what is easier to absorb and what is in the abstract and what everybody is sort of more focused on, there's also a list of the top 52 disorders that we're seeing across a bunch of different breeds. So is it talking about health? Well, it's talking about disorders that dogs go to the veterinarian for. And a lot of the disorders that are the most common things that dogs go to the veterinarian for are things that a lot of us aren't really super concerned about. So things like a broken toenail. There's chocolate ingestion, so that certainly could be fatal. It's something we're concerned about, but does it really have to do with overall health, in the sense of, is it something that when you're getting a puppy, you're going to be very concerned, but whether the puppy is likely to ingest chocolate? I mean, maybe if it's a lab, right? So then, so a lot of the conditions looked like that. So when we're talking about what health means, I think we'll go into some other questions later on about what health can look like, but I want to be very clear that exactly what question they were asking was what conditions were most commonly seen. And what they found was that the most common conditions are common things, and not the most life-threatening things. So they weren't really looking at things like heart disease and cancer as commonly. So what they did find was, in those top 10 conditions, more of them were more prevalent in mixed breed dogs than in purebred dogs. But when you expand the list to the 52 conditions, then you start seeing that more of them were seen in purebred dogs compared to mixed breed dogs. So this is something that if you're thinking that it might be that purebred dogs have some inherited disorders, meaning that they're more likely to get sort of less common things, less common than breaking a toenail, then this is pretty much what you would expect. You'd see that the mixed breed dogs are more often going to the veterinarian for the more common things, and the purebred dogs are the ones that are more commonly being seen for some inherited diseases. Yeah, Vicky says accidents or incidents rather than conditions. Those of you who've listened to my recent podcast with the wonderful Dr. Dan O'Neill will know that he basically says everything's heritable. So like chocolate toxicity, is that heritable? Some dogs are more likely to counter surf. Everything's heritable. Being hit by car is in there, I believe. Some dogs are more likely to roam. So it's all heritable. But the things that we're really concerned about, the heart disease, epilepsy, cancer, we just didn't see that in here all that often, because you don't get diagnosed with cancer 10 times in your life, but you may go multiple times for ear infections. So as you start looking into those 52 conditions that you're seeing in purebred dogs, that's when you start seeing things like KCS or dry eye, IVDD, chondrodystrophy. And so those start being things that are more serious, that are definitely more heritable, and that are tied into being a purebred dog. Dry eye KCS is very tightly associated with being brachycephalic because their eyes, it's harder for them sometimes to close their eyelids over their eyes. Their eyes are sort of more out there in the world. They have less tear production. And then IVDD, obviously associated with dogs who have been bred to have that particular chondrodystrophy gene. So that's sort of a first pass at what we're talking about there. Back at you, Sarah.
Yeah, you did a great job. I think that, to me, that makes it very clear kind of what this looked at. We need to now dig into why these like sensational headlines such as "Study busts the myth that purebred dogs have more health problems." Like we've got these sensationalized headlines like that coming out of this. And that's kind of the crux of like, that's why we wanted to talk about this, because that's what happens when a study kind of hits the mainstream and goes places and then people write about it. So I do think it's really important to talk about kind of longevity and cause of death, which are not, if I'm clear, things that were examined. Meanwhile, one of the other things that came out that was written is when it came to longevity and health profiles, mixed breed dogs didn't have a medical advantage over their purebred counterparts. So that's, again, something that was written about the study, not
What was
something
not
that
covered in the study,
but was
right?
not
This study
actually
did not look at that.
Right. So it's so important for us to be able to understand what the paper did look at so that when we read these sensational headlines and articles, we know what's going on. So that wasn't said at all in the study. To continue that quote, diet, lifestyle, and individual genetic makeup played a more direct role in the health conditions dogs experienced. Was that in the study?
No, and they do, this project does collect a lot of that information, and I presume they will publish more papers about that in the future, but this particular paper did not analyze that data at all.
Okay, another thing that I just sort of heard being thrown around on the internet is actually, because I think it's important for us to say these headlines, these kind of like, see, we knew it, purebreds are healthier than mixed breeds, like these headlines that look like that, we know where those are coming from. We know kind of a person who believes that in their heart is going to take that and run with it and be like, this is what the study said. And yet I did see some really refreshing comments from people who are breed enthusiasts or even purebred enthusiasts saying, almost disappointed in the study, almost saying like, no, this didn't actually say that at all. They still believe the study could have said that if it had gone a different way, but they're angry a little bit about the study and what it didn't say. So there's that going on. And then there's, from the same kind of crowd of folks, there's grabbing onto these headlines. And so I think it's just really important for us here to talk about, if something did want to say that purebreds are healthier, or a study wanted to point to that, what are the questions that we could ask? Like how would we actually decide that one group of dogs is healthier than the other?
So, I mean, obviously health is a pretty general concept and a little hard to define. So I would ask some more specific questions. The first question I would ask would be, on average, do purebreds live longer than mixed breed dogs? And are there studies out there that have asked that question? And I do want to emphasize again that when we talk about purebred dogs, we're talking about a really heterogeneous population. The thing about purebred dogs is that within their breed, they might be pretty similar to each other, but there's a lot of different breeds. And they, so sort of lumping them all in together can be challenging, but people have done this and asked this question. So Stremming's going to paste some of these into the chat for you guys. The first paper I want to mention is this paper by Yordi et al. In 2020. This was using the Golden Retriever lifetime study data. And they, the link that I'm giving you here goes through the Functional Dog Collaborative summary of this paper, but that will, if you go to that, if you follow that link, it will have a link in it to the original paper. So, and this study found for a given body size category, because obviously small dogs live longer than large dogs. So for a given body size category, mixed breed dogs lived on average 1.2 years longer than purebred ones. And then the next study is Erfer et al. 2020. And this is actually from some of the same authors who wrote this dog aging project paper that we're talking about right now. Although 2020 was before the dog aging project had, I believe it was before it was even founded, but it was certainly before it had started really collecting large amounts of data. So similar researchers, and they said, we did not find significant differences in lifespan between purebred and mixed breed dogs. However, breeds with larger effective population sizes and or lower inbreeding coefficients had median survival times 3 to 6 months longer than breeds with smaller effective population sizes or higher inbreeding coefficients. And for sure, it is important to, when you're looking at all these different breeds, rather than just lumping all of purebreds together, asking the question of, well, why do we think that some breeds are not as long-lived as other breeds or as mixed breed dogs? The answer often comes down to inbreeding, not always, but often it comes down to inbreeding. And so looking at inbreeding rather than age can be more useful. And I have a couple more links on that. But first, I want to mention this 2023 paper by Matta and Matta. And this is using Vet Compass data. So those of you who heard me talking to Dr. Dan O'Neill on my podcast recently, Vet Compass is the project that he heads up. So Vet Compass data showed mongrel dogs had the highest life expectancy, followed by crossbred dogs with only one purebred ancestor, and purebred dogs had the lowest life expectancy. So those are the three papers that were more recent that I could find addressing the particular question of mixed breed dogs versus purebred dogs lifespan. But there's a couple more papers out there, instead of comparing mixed breed to purebred, looking at how inbred a population is and seeing if that affects lifespan, which is, as I said, is going to get you a little bit more bang for your buck, because across all breeds, there's a great variety in how inbred different breeds are. So we have two of those. The first one is from my friend Connie Krause, and she, in 2022, so she did find that lower genetic diversity correlated with decreased lifespan. And the second one is from Danica Banish, who also has been on the podcast, and others. And they, again, found that inbreeding working with body size and morphology, the inbreeding also decreased your expected lifespan. And they found that they actually removed brachycephalic dogs from their initial attempt to analyze that, because they knew that brachycephaly was going to have such a strong effect on decreasing lifespan that they just took them out in order to more clearly ask the question about dogs with more similar body shapes to each other. And it still found that, but also found that, put them back in later on and found that brachycephaly did have its own effect. So that's lifespan. And by the way, we're rapidly coming up on the Q&A. So if you guys have questions about these papers, we can ask them. So then the other question that I would ask, aside from lifespan, is, are there specific disorders of concern that are more common in purebreds? So obviously we would like dogs to live a solid number of years, but we also want them not to get sick young. We want them not to have disorders that affect what we call their health span in addition to their lifespan. So first we have this 2013 paper by Belumori et al. And this is data out of UC Davis, which is one of the veterinary schools that is the best known for doing really good research studies. They looked at 24 heritable disorders, what a lot of people would call genetic disorders. And the line from this is purebred dogs were more likely to have 10 out of the 24 genetic disorders, including dilated cardiomyopathy, elbow dysplasia, cataracts, and hypothyroidism. Mixed breed dogs had a greater probability of ruptured cranial cruciate ligament. And that is a paper that looked at some of those less common disorders, but the ones that we find more concerning. Then there's also a 2018 paper by Donner et al. And this one looked at just the genetics of mixed breed dogs versus purebred dogs. And they found mixed breed dogs were more likely to carry a common recessive disease, whereas purebreds were more likely to be genetically affected with one, providing DNA-based evidence for hybrid vigor. So in other words, with recessive diseases, you have to have 2 copies of the allele, of the risk allele, in order to actually manifest the disease. So mixed breed dogs may have had 1 copy, but purebred dogs were much more likely to have 2 copies, and then we would expect them to actually have the disease. This paper didn't look at whether they did or not, but with a lot of these diseases, you can be fairly confident. All right, that is what I have there.
That last one, that's fascinating. That's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Now's the time for your questions. So drop them in the chat and I will be reading them to Dr. Hekman over here. But I do think what you were saying, Jessica, is so important. This is hard to pin down because purebred dogs, like that isn't a monolith. They are so different. Like looking at even just controlling for something like brachycephaly, like you talked about, changes things. And it is almost like to really make these kind of statements that folks want the science to come out and make, you would need to control for so many different things, like size, like pediatric spay neuter, like, I mean, there are so, like, talking about the cruciate ligament tears being more common in mixed breed dogs. Was that because more of the purebred dogs were left intact longer? Like we don't know, like we don't have those pieces of information, but we could spin it however which is kind of what happens, is you read it and you spin it and then you post an article about it and then everybody reads it and it gets sensationalized. So all of that is
and my biggest concern
interesting
with us doing this conversation is that people will feel that I'm spinning it for my agenda, which,
right.
I mean, we all have our agendas, and I think it's fair for me to be straightforward that I do feel that there are problems with lack of genetic diversity in purebred dogs, that not every breed is really in trouble at the moment, but there are certain breeds that are in trouble. And yeah, it's hard to see that when you look across all of breeds together. But I do have an agenda of wanting people to really take a hard look about what's going on with purebreds and think about what we can do about it. And that's part of why I really wanted this to be alive, so that people could ask questions. I really do welcome questions from people who are like, who feel that they don't agree with my take on the paper and want to talk to me about it. And I see we're not getting questions here. So
we've got one from Scotty.
Has there been a study? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Jessica, let me do my job.
I'm taking your job away from you.
All right, Scotty's asking, has there been a study that has a focus on autoimmune disease in mixed versus purebred dogs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know of one. I wonder about, though, the study that talked about, I'm just flipping back to it. So when I mentioned the Bellamore study, and I'm just taking a look at it now, the prevalence of inherited disorders, and I'm looking to see if I can get a list of what all the disorders are. Oh, they have it right here. So I'm just looking to see if any of these are going to be could be classified as autoimmune. So heart disease, hyperadrenocorticism and hypoadrenocorticism are really benign tumors. We do have hypothyroidism, which is autoimmune, that your body attacks your thyroid gland. And I will look to see what they found about that. Elbow dysplasia, hip dysplasia, IBDD, patellas, ligaments, atopy and allergic dermatitis, bloat, cataracts, epilepsy, lens luxation, portosystemic shunt. All right, so let's look at.
That's kind of the hard thing, yeah, like autoimmune disease, like that's a hard thing to pin down. Like obviously you do categorize things that way, but it is almost too broad scope.
It is. So they did find that purebred dogs, hypothyroidism was one of the disorders that they did find to be more likely in purebred dogs. So, I mean, other than that, I think you'd have to look at that. We certainly know that there are specific breeds out there that are very prone to autoimmune disorders. And so poodles, beardies, I'm sure I'm missing some,
Collies.
but those are, say again?
Collies,
Collies, yeah.
collies, Rough and Smith collies.
So, and I don't know that anyone has done that overall, looking at, there don't tend to be studies that are quite as, even as zoomed in as what Scotty asked about, right? Even though.
So it's
yeah.
not even that it's too broad scope, it's like, it's actually too zoomed in, it's the opposite problem. It's like, we
I
look
think
at,
so, yeah, because
Interesting.
these questions of like purebred versus mixed tend to be the sort of the larger data sets and the bigger. Another good resource for people who are interested in asking about this stuff again are the Vet Compass studies. So basically any study with Dr. Dan O'Neill on it, they just keep churning them out. And if for people who are interested in that, we can find
I'm gonna link Vet Compass for everyone.
yeah, if you can find it, there's a page which has a link to some of their more recent papers. But basically what they do is they go through by disorder and they will take a look at information coming out of primary care practices in the UK. And so it's interesting, right? It's primary care. So sometimes there's disorders that people are more likely to go straight to referral for. So they don't, and they're very upfront about this, that the numbers that they find are not necessarily the prevalence over all dogs because they're seeing it in primary care. But they do pick that apart disorder by disorder. And so you can find studies about particular disorders, you can find which breeds they found were more common. They'll always compare that to mixed breeds. So for things like that. So to answer you then, Scotty, that's what I would do is go look at Vet Compass, and it won't be autoimmune in general, but there will be individual diseases. It looks like we
Okay,
have another.
We've got two more questions from Carrie. The first one is in relation to hybrid vigor with the many congenital issues, which might not be the word that we actually want there. So I'll leave that to you to explain that word and say the other words that we have now introduced to so many breeds. Would it seem that hybrid vigor would also be reduced versus maybe what it was historically? Do you understand that question?
Parsing this. Do you
Carrie,
understand?
I don't think I understand that question, Carrie. So Carrie, I'm gonna jump to your other question. We'll answer that. And if you want to rephrase your hybrid vigor question, that would help us. Okay, so Carrie's other question is, how do you think the demographics of the owners affect studies like this? Which of course they would.
Yeah, and we had this problem with the Mutt paper, the Darwin's Ark paper as well. So this is absolutely getting at people who are interested in answering lots of questions about their dogs on the internet. And that is a very specific group of people who manage their dogs a very specific way. Now, it certainly is likely to be true that those of you who have bothered to listen to this fall into that group of people. So the study is probably about us and people who are similar to us. It is probably not about dogs owned by people who are not similar to us. And then the obvious question is, how do we define us? What do we look like? What do other people look like? And you have to ask them about the owner demographics, which I'm not sure they even have. So unfortunately, in order to get demographics about the owners, you have to get approval to study humans, which is harder than approval to study dogs. And so with Darwin's Ark, we didn't ask owner demographics, or we couldn't ask questions about the owners. We couldn't say, do you smoke? We could say things like, does the dog live in a house where there is smoking? We could ask for address, but we couldn't ask specific questions about the humans. So we could do things like look at the zip code. And we certainly didn't publish about that in the paper. I don't know if there's been more work done on that since then. So they might be able to break some things down by zip code, but I doubt they have questions like, what's the annual income of the household that the dog lives in. I'm guessing they haven't asked that, although I don't know for sure. But it's absolutely this is a set of people almost certainly who are very likely to take their dogs to the veterinarian and to mostly remember what happened at the veterinarians. And there are certainly other people who manage their dogs very differently.
Yeah,
How does that
so,
affect the findings? I don't know.
and that's almost for a different kind of researcher, and again, like you said, different approvals to even look at what that does. Kristen had essentially the same question regarding the owners. So Carrie has rewritten their question. Do you think that hybrid vigor was more important or more pronounced historically? So we've because of introduction of issues. Are you understanding the question now?
I think so, that hybrids now have just as much disease. Does it make more sense?
So, okay,
So,
Sarah
okay.
West came in and rephrased, the individual breeds are so unhealthy now. Won't any hybrids from them also be unhealthy?
unhealthy.
Yeah, okay, that was
Yeah,
good,
so
thank you.
there's two ways of looking at this. And so let's set hybrid vigor aside because I think it is a less scientific term. So let's break it up into two separate things. So one question is, does reducing inbreeding or increasing genetic diversity have a positive effect? And yes, I would expect that is just a constant. That is not something that is going to have changed historically. So that's looking at things like, there's an interesting paper recently, again, out of the Golden Retriever lifetime data, looking at reduction in litter size in Goldens, and that was found to be correlated to inbreeding. So the more inbred, the smaller litter size the dogs had. So things like that, and those are, there's a bunch, often with the really complex things like that, there's a whole bunch of alleles scattered throughout the genome. And it's as they sort of, as this load starts sort of becoming more and more homozygous throughout the genome, just breeding out to other breeds can help with that. But the separate question is one of whether, if you have a dog from one breed and you want to cross it to another breed, can you find another breed that doesn't have the matching problems? And so that's sort of a question of how related are the two breeds? Do they have the same problems that you're looking at? You're definitely going to see an improvement because you'll be increasing genetic diversity. But yes, if they double up on particular disorders, then you won't be you won't be increasing genetic diversity as much, if that makes sense. So therefore, it would be harder to see an improvement because it's harder to increase genetic diversity if they are related in the sense of having the same genetic risk factors. Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense to me.
Okay.
Carrie, number one, if we didn't answer your question, let us know. Carrie's saying, yes, we answered the question, and they say thank you.
Okay,
so that's
good.
Fantastic. So Sarah's got a new question. How likely is it that the two different breeds have the exact same defective alleles causing the disorder?
So, and it depends on the disorder, right? So when you're looking, I mean, certainly if you're looking at, I don't know if most of you understand the different concept of Mendelian or single gene genetics versus complex phenotype genetics. So the Mendelian traits are things that we can do very, very reliable genetic tests for. I like to reach for von Willebrand's disease as a really good example, where it's very clear, right? The dog can have no copies. If it has one copy, it's a carrier. If it has two copies, it's going to express the disease. I've unfortunately had some people point out that there's, even with the dogs that are affected that have two copies, there's some variation in how the disease expresses. So it's, even then, it's not a perfect example. But with Mendelian disorders like that, it tends to be that you certainly can easily test to see if they have the same disorder. And as they are less related, you're going to be less likely to see them have the same disorder. When it's something that you can't test for, like cancer in golden retrievers, where there's probably a whole lot of risk factors that are fixed throughout the dog's genome, then I find it a lot less likely that another breed would have something complementary. So like But I mean, but even so, I wouldn't, so for example, would you cross a golden to say a Bernese mountain dog, and they both get lymphoma a fair amount? So by crossing them, would you create something that is less likely to have lymphoma because it's not homozygous? Would you have something that's equally likely to have lymphoma because they're exactly the same risk factors? Or the situation that everybody fears, would you be likely to create something that is more likely to get lymphoma? Because maybe the Goldens have one set of risk factors and the Berners have a different set of risk factors, but maybe those interact to actually then increase your risk. So when you're choosing to outcross, I would certainly choose to outcross to a breed that has a different set of disorders. But I would find it unlikely then that the mixed breed dog would express both sets of disorders, right? Having them become heterozygous does reduce the risk. Does that make sense?
I definitely think that makes sense. And I think that, yeah, and Sarah says that makes sense. And I think, that is an interesting question. I do think that's an argument that comes out a lot, is like, well, if you breed an unhealthy golden retriever to an unhealthy poodle, won't you just get more unhealthiness? And I think that we don't know specific answers to that, but we can make educated guesses based on like what's wrong with this breed and then what's wrong with this one, about the things that we can test for at least, or the things that we kind of know how they're inherited. But I also, that was another thing that I saw kind of circulating on the internet was, well, what did they say was a mixed breed in this study? Did they say golden doodles were mixed breeds, for instance? Do you know the answer to that? Was it basically breed
right.
versus like, yeah, talk about that.
Yeah, so they did consider golden doodles to be a mixed breed. So it's only if it was, really the sort of strongest definition of a purebred. The dogs didn't have to be registered, but they did have to be a breed that most people would recognize as a pure breed. So, and they did mention that it would be interesting to do follow-up work. And it was interesting in the paper, they mentioned that they considered golden doodles to all be F1 hybrids. And so I'd like to note that, of course, not all golden doodles are F1 hybrids. There's a lot of people breeding multi-generational golden doodles right now. That's the way to get the preferred coat type. That the F1s don't have the preferred coat type. They're close to it, but not the ideal. So I think looking at intentionally bred mixes, looking at F1s versus multi-generations, I think all of that would be really interesting to dive into. And while we're talking about, then the other question is, were these dogs well bred, right? So that's the other question that people bring up. And I see a lot of people dismissing the paper based on that. And it's troubling to me because I don't know of a good way for a scientific paper to get at well-bredness, because it's not a scientific.
This comes up with every
concept.
single paper. This comes up with every paper, like regardless of what it says. If it says a breed has a health problem, they'll say, the people kind of defending that breed will say, well, obviously you didn't look at a well-bred population. And it really is important for us to recognize that well-bred is not something we can actually pin down, or something that the scientific community can pin down. Kathleen says, I wish we could remove well-bred from the dog book vocabulary. Well, sure, there's all sorts of phrases. Honestly, I think, well, I'm not going to say it. I was going to say a certain word that we've said a whole lot of times should be abolished too, but I won't. Get myself into too much trouble today. Okay, so Carrie's asking, did you say they did or did not include brachycephalic breeds in the study? So you were talking about a different study that excluded them. This study did include them.
Did include them for sure. And I believe that Frenchies were one of the most common. I'm just going to the actual
That would
study.
make sense.
It's so hilarious how I so carefully had it brought up, and now when I'm looking, okay, hang on. Let me just search. Okay, so I found the study. Oh no. Okay, so I don't think Frenchies were one of the common breeds that they looked at. So we don't have that. Let me see if I can get the list of what their most common breeds were, because they did look at some top breeds, and it would be interesting.
Super interesting, actually, if Frenchies were not in the top because they are #1 in AKC registrations right
Yeah,
now.
so they looked at Labrador Retrievers, Golden Retrievers, German Shepherds,
Also very high in AKC registrations, all three of
and
them.
those are the ones that they have tables on. Yeah, but I don't see anything in the paper. I just searched for French in the paper and I didn't see, let me search for bull. Yeah, and they don't seem to have discussed bulldogs either. What about pugs? Okay, so pugs were in the top 25 breeds. Let's see if they had anything to say about them, but they don't say anything in the paper specifically about them beyond that they were in the top 25 breeds. So, again, well, let me take a look actually. Then there's the list of the top 53 medical conditions. Oh, but they don't say specific breeds in this. I think they just say whether it's more common. Yeah, so we have the top 53 medical conditions, and they don't list which breeds it's the most common in for these. Again, these are the way they found the top 53 was first they found the top 10 conditions across everybody. Then they took their top, their most common, I think 25 most common breeds, which did include pug. They found the top 10 conditions for each of those breeds. And then they found the overlap between all those, which was 53 conditions. And I just, when I was going through this, I did notice, so there's underbite, but down towards the bottom, keratoconjunctivitis sicca, so that's KCS, and entropion, and stenotic or narrow nares. So those are all things that you would expect to see, maybe not as much so the underbite, but the others you definitely expect to see in brachycephalic dogs. And the narrow nares was highly, highly significant. It wasn't super common across all, so it was 0.04% of mixed breed dogs had narrow nares, 0.37% of all purebred dogs had narrow nares, but the difference was just stunningly significant. It was one of the highest significances that they found. Right? Sorry, I'm gonna put my face really close to the computer to make sure. Yeah, 10 to the negative 19. So it was a really strongly significant finding. Was it the most? I think the dental disease was actually the most significant finding. Extracted teeth.
Meaning that was the condition that was most reported, or the reason the dogs went to
Meaning
the
that
vet.
the difference, so when I say
the
most significant,
difference.
the
Okay, thank
difference
you.
was the most statistically significant. So extracted teeth is really interesting. So 13% of mixed breed dogs had extracted teeth. 6% of purebred dogs had extracted teeth. And the significance of that was both the largest difference in actual percentage points. Like 13% versus 6%, I find something that I'd think about when buying a dog.
Absolutely.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's interesting, and it's very significant. And so why are there so many more mixed breed dogs with extracted teeth versus purebred dogs? It's interesting, particularly because in the paper they called out Chihuahuas as purebred Chihuahuas having much more dental disease and many more extracted teeth. But even with that, they found this sort of the blame lying on the mixed breed dogs, and they don't hypothesize as to why it is. It's a really interesting finding. But for brachycephaly, they clearly were looking at them because they have these issues in here that were definitely about having some brachycephalic dogs.
And again, like, we could speculate all day long as to why there was such a huge difference between between the two groups and tooth extraction regarding tooth extraction, sorry. And like that, once again, that demographic question, the like, I don't know, if you bought a dog from a breeder, did they teach you how to take care of the dog's teeth versus If you did,
Yeah,
I
or
mean,
is
there's
it
so many things we
size?
could speculate.
Is it size, like
Um,
smaller dogs are more likely to have dental disease, so were the purebreds tending to be larger? That's actually the opposite of what it expects. I'd expect
Me
purebreds
too.
to
I
be
would
the really
expect that.
small toys. So I just like I
I
can't quite
know.
figure it out. And is it that purebred people are more likely to brush their dog's teeth? Or is it that mixed breed people are more likely to actually take their dog in and recognize that as like I
No
don't know.
idea.
It could be a
It's
good or a
so
bad. Like it's just
interesting.
hard to say. Yeah.
And I know that, again, diet is one of those things that Dog Aging Project cares about, but in this study,
Did not look at it.
diet was not
Yes,
it.
did not look
And
at it.
so, I know that like for me in my personal experience, that matters as far as the teeth go. But so does the type of dog, like completely in the genetics and I mean, it's very
Mhm.
interesting. We don't know. And it's
Yeah.
again, yeah, like Amy is saying, always the issue with correlations. Exactly. Like correlation
Yeah.
does not equal causation. It was,
Right.
it is pounded into all of us who get a science degree.
Yeah, it's just why is it? Don't know.
Yeah,
Some of these there's easy answers there, but that one is not one of them. So
right, for sure. So I think we're looking at wrapping this up. If you all have last minute questions, please throw them in the chat and we will answer them.
I mean, I was really hoping someone would come basically tell me why they disagreed with me, but
If you disagree with Jessica, now's your chance.
I'm not gonna yell at you.
Not here in the live anyway.
Sarah, I don't yell at people.
I've never observed you yelling at anyone, actually. Which is so different from myself. All right. Monique is saying it would be interesting to look at purebred small poodles versus small poodle crossbreeds, specifically as someone who extracts a lot of teeth. Yeah, would be fascinating, right? There always, I think, this is what happens is like this paper comes out, the painstaking research has been done, and then as such as the nature of science, it just leads to more questions and more ideas about what else could be found. All right, Vicky's just saying thanks. Thanks for coming. Yeah, Amy's saying it's a complex data set, so it's hard to land on strong opinions. There's lots going on. That's exactly true. That's why we wanted to talk, because strong opinions abound about this paper. Like the statements, I mean, straight up false statements that we read earlier on that are true, that are statements that were published, such as, you know, the study found that for many common dog diseases, preventative veterinary care and consulting your vet when emergencies happen have more of an impact on a dog's health than its breed. Like that is just one of the random statements that like that wasn't in there. It's interesting how, I mean, such is our nature though, is to like have strong opinions. Like everyone comes to the data set with their opinion and then would like it to agree with them, right? So, right. Amy's saying that it's indefensible to say that if we're talking about health or behavior, making these like definitive claims. And I think it's also, as we've talked about here today, purebred dogs is not saying purebred dogs are healthier than mixed breed dogs. Like, even if we could pin down what health meant, even if we looked at that in certain ways, it's very difficult to say, but purebred dogs are this, and then mixed breed dogs are this.
I mean, even within a breed, right? Like looking at different
Even within a breed.
types within a breed, there can be massive differences. Yeah, it's just
Yeah,
it's hard.
for sure. So we hope that we've empowered you actually. So when you see people making big opinion claims about this study on the internet, to speak up, or even you could just point them to this live will be posted publicly. You can point them to the FDC's breakdown of the study, which we did post at the top of the comments. And thank you all for coming. And thank you, Jessica, for doing a fantastic job of disseminating all that information today.
Thank you, Stremmings. Thank you, Sarah, for keeping your head when things started falling apart and pulling this together and being an excellent host.
I tried. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. Bye-bye.